It's December 1963. Moscow is cold, quiet, ordinary. The city of 5 million people goes about its morning the way it always does. Bread queues, tram stops, frost on the windows, children bundled into coats and sent to school. It is the safest city in the world. That is what Soviet citizens were told. That is what most of them believed. Then, someone knocked on a door in the Fili district, and a woman opened it. Because the man on the other side was wearing a uniform. He said he was from Mosgaz, the Moscow City Gas Authority. He needed to check the pipes, routine inspection, wouldn't take long. She let him in. She was the last person he would kill that month. She was not the last person he would kill. This is the story of Vladimir Ionesyan, the man Moscow newspapers called Mosgaz, the killer who turned a knock on the door into a death sentence, and the case that forced the Soviet Union to do something it had never done before, admit publicly that a monster was living among its citizens. To understand Vladimir Ionesyan, you have to understand the life he was living before December 1963. He was an actor. Not a celebrated one, not a name anyone would recognize. He worked with traveling theater troupes, the kind that toured the provincial towns of the Soviet Union, performing for factory workers and collective farm laborers in drafty cultural halls. He was 26 years old, handsome in a theatrical way, charming when he wanted to be, but the charm had limits, and so did the money. Soviet traveling actors existed at the bottom of the cultural hierarchy. They moved constantly, Kazan, Sverdlovsk, Novosibirsk, back again, living out of suitcases in dormitory rooms, paid by the performance, never earning enough to stay anywhere long. No apartment of their own, no stability, no future that looked different from the present. Ionesyan had been doing this for years. He was tired of it. And then there was Aleftina. Aleftina Dmitrieva was his girlfriend. She traveled with him. She was part of his world. Or perhaps he had become part of hers. The exact nature of their relationship is difficult to reconstruct because Soviet investigators were not particularly interested in it. What they established was simpler. She knew. Not everything, perhaps, but enough. And she stayed. What does it mean that she stayed? It means he wasn't a mystery to her the way he was to everyone else. It means there were conversations we will never have access to. Late-night arguments in provincial hotel rooms, silences over shared meals, moments where she must have understood what kind of man she was with. She stayed anyway. Whether out of love, or fear, or something else entirely, the record does not say. By the autumn of 1963, Ionesyan needed money, not in the abstract way that everyone needs money, in the specific, pressing way that comes when you are 26 years old and can see that nothing is going to change. That the traveling, the dormitory rooms, the drafty halls, that this is your life and it will remain your life, and the system that was supposed to provide for everyone has provided you with very little. He began to think about solutions, and he arrived at one. The uniform was not accidental. Ionesyan was an actor. He understood, better than most people, what a costume does to the person wearing it and to the people looking at them. A uniform doesn't just change how others see you, it changes how they respond to you. It closes off the part of their mind that asks questions. Mosgaz workers came to people's apartments regularly. Everyone knew the routine. Everyone opened the door. He obtained the uniform, he found an axe, and he began. The first murder was in December 1963. The victim was a boy. His name was Volodya Kortkov. He was 9 years old. His parents were at work, the way many Soviet children were in those years, with both parents required to work full-time and formal childcare stretched thin. Ionesyan knocked. Volodya opened the door. The boy had no reason not to. Men from Mosgaz came to check the gas all the time. It was routine. It was official. It was safe. Ionesyan stepped inside. The details of what followed are documented in Soviet investigative records. What matters here is this. When Volodya's parents came home that evening, their son was dead, and the man who had killed him was already on a tram somewhere in Moscow, dressed like any other citizen. The murders continued. Over the following weeks, Ionesyan killed at least 5 people, men and women, young and old. He chose apartments seemingly at random, or perhaps by opportunity. A door at the right moment, a person who seemed to be alone. Always the same approach, always the uniform, always the same line. Mosgaz, gas inspection. I need to check inside. The method worked because of something specific to Soviet urban life. Citizens were conditioned to comply with official representatives. You did not argue with someone in uniform. You did not demand identification in a way that might seem suspicious or antisocial. You opened the door. You cooperated. That was what Soviet citizens did. Ionesyan understood this instinctively. He used the obedience the system had built into people as the instrument of their deaths. By late December, the city began to realize something was wrong. Information spread the way it always spread in the Soviet Union. Not through official channels, but through whisper networks. Neighbors talking in stairwells, women in bread queues, factory workers at lunch. A man posing as a gas inspector, an axe. Don't open your door. The rumors were terrifying precisely because they were vague. People didn't know how many had been killed. They didn't know if the killer was one man or several. They didn't know if he was targeting specific people or choosing victims at random. The uncertainty was its own kind of weapon. Moscow, a city that prided itself on order, on safety, on the collective protection of the Soviet state, was afraid to answer its own front door. And then the Soviet government did something remarkable. Something that had almost never happened before. They told the public. On January 11th, 1964, newspapers across Moscow printed a warning. A man was impersonating a Mosgaz worker. He was dangerous. Citizens should not open their doors to strangers claiming to be from the gas authority without first verifying their credentials through official channels. The warning did not use the word murderer. It did not describe the victims. It said almost nothing specific, but it said enough. And for the Soviet press, which existed primarily to report achievements, production quotas, and party victories, the mere fact of a public warning about a violent criminal was extraordinary. It was 1963. Nikita Khrushchev was in power. The thaw was underway. That brief, fragile period after Stalin's death when Soviet society breathed slightly more freely, when some truths could be spoken, some crimes acknowledged, some victims named. The Ionesyan case landed in that narrow window. Whether the decision to go public was made out of genuine concern for citizens, or because the panic had become too large to contain, no one outside the Kremlin could say for certain. Perhaps both. The newspaper warning produced something unexpected. It produced a name. Citizens who had seen the man, who had opened their doors and survived, who had noticed him on their stairwells, who had glimpsed him in their buildings, began to come forward. Descriptions accumulated, composite images were assembled, and someone, somewhere, recognized the face. Vladimir Ionesyan had not returned to Moscow. After the January warning, he had left the city with Aleftina. They went east to Kazan, an industrial city on the Volga River, more than 700 kilometers away. Maybe he believed the distance would be enough. Maybe he wasn't thinking clearly anymore. Maybe Aleftina had her own reasons for going, and her own reasons for not leaving. Police tracked him through railway records and informant networks, the slow, thorough machinery of Soviet internal security, which could be many things, but was rarely unable to find a man who had been publicly identified. On January 17, 1964, less than 7 weeks after the first murder, Vladimir Ionesyan was arrested in Kazan. He offered no resistance. He had been a free man for 47 days. Detectives expected rage, or fear, or something that looked like remorse. Instead, when they sat Ionesyan down and began to question him, he was almost calm. He confessed without much pressure. He spoke about the murders the way a man might describe a series of practical decisions. One thing, then another, then another. He needed money. He had identified a method. He had carried it out. There was no talk of compulsion, no eruption of buried emotion, no moment where investigators felt they were touching the truth beneath the surface. Just a man describing what he had done, in a voice that was quieter than it should have been. What was happening inside him, whether there was something he chose not to say or whether the flatness went all the way down, no one could establish. Soviet forensic psychiatry in 1964 was not equipped, or perhaps not inclined, to push much further. The system wanted a verdict, not an explanation. Alevtina Dmitrieva was arrested alongside him. She was convicted of complicity, sentenced to prison. She had known. She had stayed. That was enough. The trial was not public in the way that Western trials are. No reporters in the gallery, no proceedings published in detail. The Soviet judicial system moved quickly and without ceremony. Vladimir Ionesyan was found guilty of 5 murders. He was sentenced to death. On January 31, 1964, 14 days after his arrest, he was executed. He was 26 years old. In the years that followed, the Mosgaz case disappeared from official Soviet memory almost as quickly as it had surfaced. There were no detailed accounts published, no investigative retrospectives. The names of the victims were not commemorated. The case was closed, the criminal executed, and the state moved on. But in the apartments of Moscow, in the buildings where people had learned to fear a knock at the door, something had changed. For a generation of Muscovites, the word Mosgaz never meant just a gas company again. And the question that the Soviet state was not interested in asking, the question that stays with you long after the verdict, is not about Ionesyan at all. It's about the door, about the 9-year-old boy who opened it, about every person who heard that knock and felt nothing but the ordinary trained reflex of a Soviet citizen. The authority is here. Let them in. Vladimir Ionesyan didn't break through the system. He walked through it, wearing its own face. This has been Red Files. If this story stayed with you, subscribe. Because there are more files to open. New case. Next week. The Ionesyan case is documented in Soviet criminal records and contemporary press reports from January 1964. The decision to issue a public warning through Moskovskaya Pravda and other state newspapers remains one of the earliest instances of Soviet authorities publicly acknowledging an active violent criminal to the civilian population. Red Files does not glorify violence. These stories are told to remember the victims and to understand how such crimes were allowed to happen.